Welcome back to Mathatai. I'm Mike, and today we're going to continue our study of apologetics, looking at the ontological argument for the existence of God. Last time we introduced apologetics as a discipline, looked at the purpose of apologetics, and a little bit of the heart behind apologetics, and 4 arguments that I felt were the strongest available arguments that when put together, they lead us to a rational conclusion that God does exist. And now we're going to unpack each of those 4 arguments one at a time. In this video, we'll take the ontological argument. Now, the ontological argument stretches back to Anselm in the 11th century. Anselm was a Benedictine monk who later became the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he finished a work called the Monologium in 1077. And in the Monologium, Anselm used the moral arguments and the cosmological arguments for the existence of God. We're going to consider both of those arguments in a later video. But he felt after writing that work that those were too complex of an argument, and he was looking for a more simplistic explanation for the existence of God, a more simplistic proof. And so a year later, he worked on a writing called the Proslogium. And in the Proslogium, he presents his ontological argument. And at the time, this was an argument that Anselm tried to go back and argue for the existence of God without the use of empirical evidence. In other words, he tried to make an a priori argument, an argument from reason alone. And so if we can simply come up with reasonable explanations for God and lay out a reasonable track for why God exists, then we can prove that he exists. This was Anselm's attempt. And so, first of all, the name ontological comes from the Greek word ontos, which means being. And it simply argues that God is the greatest conceivable being, and as the greatest conceivable being, necessary existence must be one of his attributes or qualities. And so God not only exists, but God necessarily exists, which means he can't not possibly not exist. I know that's a double negative, but God has to exist, is what this argument is meant to conclude. And so I want to unpack Anselm's version of the argument first of all. And he had his critics. He was arguing with a fellow monk named Guanilo as he was writing Proslogium. And down through the centuries, he's had a number of critics there as well, including Immanuel Kant and some others. But he's also had his supporters and those who have also tried to present this argument as well. Down throughout the years, Duns Scotus, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, more recently, Norman Malcolm and Alvin Plantinga have also made arguments using the ontological form. And we'll explore a couple of these. We're going to start looking at Anselm's form of the argument, and then we're going to look a little bit at Descartes' form, and then we'll finish up looking at what Plantinga has added to this argument for us. And each one of them have brought slightly different ideas and concepts that help us out. Now, this main argument, the main purpose of the ontological argument is to prove the existence of God from the concept of God. So through abstract reasoning, we should be able to arrive that God exists if we simply conceptualize who God is. And it doesn't require any empirical evidence. There's no looking out at nature and coming to any conclusions. This is rationale alone, using our mind and our reason alone. Now, let's start first of all with a few definitions. Now, when we're talking about the ontological argument, we're talking about the being God. We're simply meaning it's the being that which none greater can be conceived. So God is the greatest possible being. And as the greatest possible being, he exists in our thoughts. We can conceive of God. We can imagine what God is like, and we can ascribe certain attributes to God. And if we're going to do that, then one of those attributes, this argument says, must be existence, because it would be greater for this being to actually exist rather than exist only in our imagination or in our thoughts. And so the existence of this being is greater than the non-existence in actuality, or the existence of this being only in our minds. And so this argument says if God is that greatest conceivable being, he must actually exist. Otherwise, we can have a greater conceived being that actually does exist. Now, Anselm put the argument this way. His first premise was that God is then that which no greater can be conceived. Okay, so think about whatever being you can. Think of the maximally great attributes that this being can have: goodness, holiness, justice, righteousness, all of these things. And God is the maximal form of all of these attributes in a single being. So God has the greatest of all of these attributes. We would even say as Christians that he is infinite in all of these attributes. There is no end to his goodness and his mercy and his love and his justice. But God has the maximal greatness of all of these attributes that we can even conceive of. And his second premise would say, if God is that than which none greater can be conceived, then there is nothing greater than God that can be imagined. So if you can think of a being that would be greater than God in his attributes, then that being would now become God, because God is our greatest conceivable being. Okay? And so if you can conceive of anything greater than your idea of God, then that new thing becomes God itself. So whatever God is the greatest being that we can conceive of. All right. Now, his first conclusion is simply that therefore there is nothing greater than God that can be imagined. Okay, so God is our greatest possible being that we can even imagine or conceive of. He adds a third premise in there that says, if God does not exist, then there is something greater than God that can be imagined. Because we can imagine a being that has all of those attributes of God, but actually exists. And that would be a greater being. And so therefore, he concludes, God must exist. God necessarily exists. Now, a couple of things we need to consider as we're looking at this argument. The first premise there, that God is that than which none greater can be conceived, this is simply a conception or a definition of God. So we can change the definition. We can argue over that definition. That's the only way we could attack this premise, is if that definition is wrong. If God is not the greatest possible conceived being, then he must be something else, and we need to change the definition. But premise 2 is a simple logical truth, that if God is the greatest conceivable being, then there can't be any others that are greater than him. So therefore, that has to be who God is. And then the first conclusion, that there's none greater than God that can be imagined, that's a simple conclusion following from premises 1 and 2. So no arguments here unless you want to argue with our definition of God, and that's certainly available. Now, the premise 3, which says if God does not exist, then there is something greater than God that can be imagined. This one, Anselm argues because he compares a non-existent God with an existent God. If God does not exist, that's not a very great God, because a God that actually exists would be even greater. And so he argues there that the existent God is greater than the non-existent God. And therefore, if God is the greatest conceivable being, existence must be a part of that being. And so our conclusion 2 would have to follow from conclusion 1 and premise 3, that if God is the greatest possible being that can be imagined, greatest conceivable being, and there's none that can be greater than him, that's conclusion 1. And if God does not exist, then something greater than him could be conceived, i.e. that thing that does exist, then God must exist. Otherwise, God cannot be the greatest possible being. And so that was Anselm's presentation of this argument. He's arguing from pure intellect, pure reason, to argue that God is the greatest being, and necessary existence is an attribute of the greatest possible being, because actually existing is greater than possibly existing, or existing only in the imagination, and therefore God must exist. Otherwise, we shouldn't have that conception. Now, a few objections that we could place to this. We already mentioned from our premise 1 about our definition of God. We could always change that definition. Perhaps God has a different concept to some of us, or perhaps some of us might present a different definition of God. We could certainly do that. A second difficulty with this argument could be existence as a character trait or an attribute. Is existence a quality or an attribute that a being possesses? Or is it a state that a being experiences? We can now get into some of the semantics of that and decide, is that an attribute of this God, or of us in any way? Or is that something that is simply thrust upon us that we don't necessarily possess? And so we could get into that. And then we could also argue, perhaps, is it greater to exist than to exist only in the imagination? Perhaps someone might want to try an argument at that. But those are a couple of the potential issues that were laid out here. But Anselm kind of gives a clear argument. Now, after Anselm kind of fell out of popularity for a couple of hundred years, Guanilo and Anselm went back and forth. This pure reason argument didn't resound a lot back in the 11th century, 12th century. It wasn't until the 1500s when Middle Age thinking and Middle Age philosophy and theology began to develop that Descartes comes along and revives the theory in a new way for many of us. Now, Descartes put a certain twist on this to fit his medieval theology. He argues not from an arbitrary definition of God. So he takes that first premise of Anselm about God being the greatest conceivable being, and he calls that an arbitrary definition. He says that's not arbitrary, but he says that you have an innate intuition that's simply given to you. It's an intuition that you possess apart from any reason or evidence. You just know that God exists. You just know what God is. And so his existence is indirectly inferred from this. And so his necessary existence is contained in this idea of a supremely perfect being. And you simply know that he exists apart from reason and apart from evidence. And so Descartes is going to try to take that route with this. Now, in medieval theology and medieval philosophy, you are able to know what a thing is, that is, what its essence is, what the attributes are, without knowing whether that thing exists. And so you can know the properties of God. However, one of the properties of God would be necessary existence. Therefore, God must actually exist. And so it's a step further on Anselm's argument, getting us back to those rationale and the reason behind our definition of God and the existence of God stemming from that definition. So Descartes also compares this to mathematical truths. For example, we know that the number 2 is an even number. Now, we don't need any empirical evidence. There's really no proof outside of a priori reasoning or reason from our rationale, from our intellect alone, to define 2 as even. And so in the same way, we simply know that God exists because we have an intuition. We know who God is, and we know existence must be one of his characters. And so this is how Descartes puts it. So let me give you a couple versions of this and see if I can explain it a little bit for you. Version A simply says this. Premise 1 says, whatever I clearly and distinctly perceive to be contained in the idea of something is true about that thing. So in other words, if I have a perception, either a visual or a sensual perception or an intellectual perception of a thing, then it's true about that thing. So if I perceive the sky to be blue, then it's blue. If I perceive 2 to be even, then 2 is even. And so my perception now, if it's an accurate perception, here again, we can argue the accuracy of our perceptions, whether we're being duped or whether those perceptions are being led in some way. But those perceptions are contained in the idea of something. Secondly, he says, I clearly and distinctly perceive that necessary existence is contained in the idea of God. Again, you have an innate intuition about who God is. God is this being that has this set of characteristics. And you can innately know that God simply exists. God necessarily exists. God cannot not exist. And so, therefore, his conclusion is that God does exist. I know it because I simply have an innate intuition about God. And in order for me to have that intuition, God must actually possess that attribute. And therefore, I perceive that attribute as an attribute of God. Therefore, God must exist. I know it seems like he's defining God into existence, and that is perhaps the case. We'll talk about the limits of this argument as we finish up this video in just a moment. Now, as Descartes discusses this first version here, he actually kind of breezes over the first premise and he focuses on the second. Remember, his first premise was that he clearly and distinctly perceives something to be contained in the idea, then that means it's true of that thing. Okay? He argues that you only need to perceive that necessary existence pertains to the idea of a supremely perfect being or of God. And once you perceive that, then that has to be true of this thing. So formal arguments are no longer required. You no longer need to prove anything else. Your intuition's perception of the self-existence of God, the necessary existence of God, is enough, and God is now self-evident to you. You no longer need argumentation. So it's a tricky way to try to get around the need for a rationale. But he says if you simply perceive God, as a being to have necessary existence, then it's now self-evident to you that God must necessarily exist. That was his first attempt. Now, he created a second version of this argument. And then the second one, he changes the verbiage a little bit. And his first premise is, I have an idea of a supremely perfect being, i.e., that is a being that has all perfections. So we're back to our concept of the greatest possible conceivable being, but now I have an idea of a being that possesses all of the greatest attributes to their infinite. And so that's our concept of God. He's kind of defining God again there. And his second premise would say, necessary existence is a perfection. So if this being has all of the perfections as a supremely perfect being, necessary existence must be one of those perfections that he possesses. And therefore, the conclusion is that a supremely perfect being exists. So if we're going to conceive of a being that has all of the perfections in their maximal form, necessary existence must be one of those perfections, and therefore this being must necessarily exist. And so he's again arguing for God using reason alone. There's no evidence outside of this. He's trying to get back to a self-intuition that you have, that God is evident to you. You know who God is because that's evident to you in your definition of God as the greatest possible being. And this greatest possible being has an attribute of necessary existence as one of his perfections. Therefore, he must necessarily exist. Now, pushing this forward into modern times, Alvin Plantinga is a philosopher of religion who's taken up this ontological argument, written quite extensively on it, and created some incredible leaps forward on this, especially with our modern view of science and our modern understanding of philosophy. He's brought a lot more to the table here that I'd like to present. Now, I'm taking a form of this argument that was given by William Lane Craig in a book called To Everyone an Answer, edited by Francis Beckwith, William Lane Craig, and J.P. Moreland. It's got all sorts of material on apologetics there, but there's a chapter in there dealing with the ontological argument written by William Lane Craig, and he summarizes Alvin Plantinga's version of the ontological argument as this. We'll walk through it piece by piece. He says, first of all, premise one, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. So now we're dealing with the possibility of the existence of God. We're not saying that God definitely does exist. We're saying it's simply possible. There is we can conceptualize a being that does exist. That possibility is there. No one should doubt that. No one should doubt the possibility that a God could exist. Okay. The second premise takes us a step further. It says, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being in some possible world exists. So if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can conceive now of a possible world in which this great being does exist. Okay. Now, what we're introducing here in this argument, what Plantinga brings into this, is the idea of possible worlds. Now, when we talk about possible worlds, we're saying that things could have been other than they are in this actual world. And we can change one small thing and have another possible world that would be different than this one in some way. And so if we took all of the different attributes of this world and we tweaked one of them and created a different world with that different attribute, we have a different possible world that could exist. Now, there are certain worlds that are impossible, and those would be logically contradictory statements. We can't have a world in which circles are four-sided objects. We can't have a world in which 2 plus 2 equals 74. So we can't have these types of things. But in a possible world, to get into some of those other impossible worlds, we'd have to change the laws of logic and change the way we look at things. But using our laws of logic and other possible worlds, the way that could have been created, the way that could have been made, it's possible that God does actually exist in some possible world. Now, his third premise goes on to state, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it must exist in every possible world. In order to be maximally great, this being must have existence in every possible world. Otherwise, we could think of a more maximally great being that actually does exist in every possible world. So to exist in some possible world is a good thing. That's you and I. We exist in this possible world, in this actual world. But if you were able to exist, or you did exist in every possible world that could be out there, that would be maximally great for you to have that type of existence. And so a maximally great being, if he exists in this world, would have to exist in every possible world. Fourth premise takes that a step further. It says if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it must exist in this actual world, because this is one of the possible worlds. It happens to be the actual one. Therefore, a maximally great being who exists in every possible world must exist in this possible world. And his conclusion is that if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then this maximally great being exists. So again, we're taking that same a priori style of argument, arguing from the concept of God, God being a maximally great being, or the greatest possible being we can conceive of, the maximal perfections contained in a single being. Necessary existence must be one of those perfections, according to Anselm and Descartes. According to Plantinga, if he's going to be maximally great, he would actually exist in every possible world that we can conceive of. And therefore, there must be a God in every possible world. And if there's a God in every possible world, there has to be a God in this world. And so God must therefore exist. Now, as we conclude this, Plantinga recognized that this is not a proof for the existence of God. Not everyone who understands the central premise of this argument, that God is this maximally great one, comes to that conclusion that God therefore must exist. Not everybody's going to hold this as a necessary truth. We may argue different points of this argument. We can argue again if existence is an attribute of a being that he would possess, or if it's simply a characteristic imposed upon the being, whatnot. So what this argument does add to our arsenal of arguments, and again, we're going to go through a couple more arguments in separate videos, but what it does add to us is the idea or the notion that there's nothing contrary to reason in holding that there is a belief in God. There's nothing irrational in accepting the existence of God. We're not checking our brain at the door, as some have said. We're not abandoning reason and rationality to pursue this being called God. And so that's what this argument does. It shows a rational reason for God's existence. Now, Plantinga, in his work, God, Freedom, and Evil, and from 1974, when he was working on some of this, in a section stated, the argument restated and vindicated, he comes to this conclusion. He says, what I claim for this argument is that it establishes not the truth of theism, but its rational acceptability. And hence it accomplishes at least one of the aims of the tradition of natural theology. And so as we consider the ontological argument, as you mull over this, and I encourage you to think it through and consider what this might mean for you, realize that this doesn't arrive at a proof for the existence of God. It simply adds a rational understanding of the character of God and the existence of God in this world. It is not irrational to assume God exists or to conclude that God exists, but it is certainly rational. It is certainly acceptable epistemologically, according to our foundations, that God does exist. So stick with us next time. We're going to take on the teleological argument, explore how that one will add to our understanding of these things. Make sure you like and subscribe, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.